Although literature and philosophy are incredibly different, people often confuse them. I remember that once within a week a literature professor told me that philosophy is nothing more than boring literature, and a philosophy professor told me that literature is nothing more than poor philosophy. Neither were correct. Sure, there are similarities between philosophy and literature. Both deal with truth, beauty, words, and ethics, but just because two things work with common materials does not necessarily make them the same thing. Respiratory therapy and dentistry both involve the mouth, but I would not want a respiratory therapist drilling my teeth. Electricians and painters both work with houses, but I would not want a painter installing my light switches. Similarly, even though philosophy and literature do deal with some of the same issues, does not mean that one is a poorer version of the other. They are different subjects with different goals, performed by different people with different sets of skills. The reason I am telling you this is so that you can prepare to put yourselves in the correct mindset for today's lecture. Indeed, in today's lecture I will deal with ethical issues relevant to the course, namely the issues of race and ethnicity. However, I will approach these issues traveling not upon the philosophical boulevard that has become so familiar to us, but rather upon more literary lanes. Therefore, as philosophy and literature are significantly different, you will not be able to digest the ethical edibles I offer if you remain in the philosophical attitude. They are digestible only if taken as the literary musings that they are. Having thus warned you of the change in academic tenor of today's lecture, we are able to dive into Flannery O'Connor's masterpiece of a short story, The Displaced Person. The story, in summary and devoid of flowery elaboration, is as follows. Mrs. McIntyre's farm is not doing well. Her only help is a pair of African Americans, Astor and Sulk, and a working-class white family, the Shortleys, all of whom are lazy. The farm, however, seems to be saved when Mrs. McIntyre, in response to the request of the local priest, hires the Guizaks, a displaced family from Nazi-infested Poland. Mr. Guizak, in fact, is such an efficient worker, Mrs. McIntyre soon decides to fire the Shortleys. Mrs. Shortley is so offended at being replaced by a family she is convinced to be violent and devious Europeans. She has a stroke and dies. Mr. Shortley leaves town for a while, but eventually comes back to Mrs. McIntyre's farm, where he is welcomed. Throughout all of this, Mrs. McIntyre starts to get irritated at Mr. Guizak and his European ways. Worst of all, Mr. Guizak suggests that his cousin marry the African-American Sulk. Such backwards thinking, Mrs. McIntyre decides, shows that the Guizaks cannot be trusted. However, she can't quite bring herself to fire the Guizaks because of the constant presence of the local priest. The problem is solved, however, when Mr. Guizak is killed in a farming accident. The accident is no one's fault, but could have been prevented by Mrs. McIntyre, Sulk, or Mr. Shortley. After the accident, Sulk and Mr. Shortley both leave the farm, and Mrs. McIntyre becomes terribly sick. Happy story, huh? Obviously not, but as in life, we can often make our most insightful literary observations when the subject is tragic. One such tragic bound observation that I would like to point out is how incredibly ordered the society is in which the displaced person takes place. Indeed, everyone in this 1950s southern U.S. society has a set position based on their race and class. As a white landowner, Mrs. McIntyre is clearly at the top of the pecking order. Next come the Shortleys, the white working-class family. Then at the bottom come the African-American workers, Astor and Sulk. But then the Guizaks show up. This family doesn't fit in anywhere. They certainly don't fit in with the African-Americans. They aren't black, and everyone is horrified when Mr. Guizak suggests that his cousin marry Sulk. The Guizaks also lack land and power, so they don't fit in with Mrs. McIntyre. They are even omitted from entry from the group they are closest to, the white working class. Indeed, the Shortleys will have nothing to do with the Guizaks, since the Polish family is European and potentially even of the devil. By not fitting in, the Guizaks pose a challenge to the society in which they find themselves. Indeed, the society must do one of two things. It can either change so as to accommodate this new group, or it can refuse to change and so reject the Guizaks. Clearly, society chooses the latter. Every part of society, from upper-class white to lower-class black, chooses to stand by and allow Mr. Guizak to die, thus eliminating the challenge that he poses. Through this narrative, I see the displaced person asking at least three questions. The first of these questions is this: How is our own society ordered along racial and ethnic lines? Clearly, our society is not as precisely ordered according to races and classes as is the society in the displaced person, but still I believe there are ways in which we as modern Americans order ourselves. Indeed, white men still have privilege in our society, all the way from social settings to political spheres of action. The second question O'Connor's story raises is whether or not any groups are left out of our society in the manner that the Gweezaks are left out of theirs. O'Connor's story makes us ask, in other words, whether there are any people who do not fit into the order of modern society in the same way that the Gweezaks do not fit into the order of the society in the displaced person. There is a group of people who come to my mind, namely, illegal immigrants. Like the Gweezaks, this group of people is attempting to join American society, but have not yet found a place within its order. Like the Gweezaks, they thus demand that we either change the way we think of American society so as to accommodate them, or refuse to change and so reject them. This then brings us to the last question the displaced person asks us, namely, how should we respond to the challenges made by those who do not fit in? As we have already seen, there are two possible routes we can take. We can either change society so as to accommodate the group, or we can remain the same and reject the group. In the displaced person, society takes the latter route. The Gweezaks are rejected. The result of this rejection, however, is nothing less than the complete disintegration of society. Everyone in the story winds up either dead, absent, or deathly ill. It seems then that the displaced person suggests taking the former route, and changing our society to incorporate groups like the Gweezaks and illegal immigrants. Such a course of action seems better not only for the group challenging a certain society, but also for the society itself. Now, such a change will be an admittedly radical one, striking to the core of society and the roles people play within it. To follow such a route would be nothing less than revolutionary. This then concludes my first main observation concerning race and ethnicity drawn from O'Connor's The Displaced Person. I have, however, two more observations, both of which, however, I promise, will be brief. The first of these latter two observations is this. Many of the problems of the story stem from the characters looking at the Gweezaks as mysterious. Mrs. Shortley, for instance, imagines Polish people as secretly brutal killers because of the Holocaust newsreel she saw. Mrs. McIntyre, on the other hand, finds Mr. Gweezak's suggestion that his cousin marry Sulk absolutely baffling. She cannot comprehend how a moral person could suggest such a thing. This element of mystery that builds up around the Gweezaks thus leaves the Shortleys and Mrs. McIntyre wondering, who are these people and what evils are they capable of? It is ultimately these fears based in mystery that leads to their unanimous rejection of the Gweezaks. This rejection, in turn, causes disastrous consequences not only for the Gweezaks, but also for the Shortleys and Mrs. McIntyre. The displaced person thus challenges us to think about how we can avoid the evils that follow from building up mystery around people of other ethnicities. The displaced person seems to suggest a rather simple solution to this challenge. Indeed, the Gweezaks would not have come to be seen as mysterious by the Shortleys and Mrs. McIntyre had the latter two parties simply gotten some education on what being Polish entails. It wouldn't have taken more than a day for the Shortleys to realize that the Poles were hardly behind the Holocaust. Similarly, Mrs. McIntyre could have attempted to learn why Mr. Gweezak saw no problem with his cousin marrying a black man. Had the characters in the story received education of this sort, we can imagine that their fears of the Gweezaks may have been eliminated and the story's disastrous conclusion avoided. Therefore, the displaced person seems to suggest that we could avoid the disastrous consequences that come from treating other ethnicities as mysterious simply by taking the time to learn about them. A good lesson. The last observation I would like to make is rather superficial to the story and perhaps even a bit cheesy. However, there's also a ring of truth and importance about it. Namely, O'Connor's story as a whole paints a rather dark picture of society. It paints a picture of society immorally structured according to race, class, and ethnicity. However, O'Connor suggests that even in such a society, there is hope for meaningful and unbiased interaction on the personal level. For instance, O'Connor shows us that Mrs. McIntyre and Mrs. Shortley can be friends, even though they are from different levels of society. What I see this hopeful interaction and others like it found in the story doing is posing a challenge to us. Namely, I see O'Connor as telling us that even when society seems morally bankrupt, and even when it is divided along class, gender, and ethnic lines, we can at least momentarily overcome these boundaries through everyday personal interactions, through cups of coffee, chess matches, and conversation.